It looks like we're at the top of the hour, so let's get underway. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Global Financial Integrity's panel discussion focused on our new report titled Made in China, China's Role in Transnational Crime and Illicit Financial Flows, which is now available on our website at gfintegrity.org. My name is Tom Cardamone. I am President and CEO of Global Financial Integrity, and I'm delighted you're able to join us today for this very important and timely conversation about China's role in global crime, money laundering, and illicit financial flows. As you are all aware, China has been in the news quite a bit lately, including the announcement of a new 5-year term for Xi Jinping, some saber rattling related to Taiwan, and the recent US ban on the export of advanced computer chips to China. With that as the background, today we have an expert group of commentators who will address the role China plays in human and wildlife trafficking, counterfeiting and IP theft, its role in fentanyl trafficking, and massive amounts of funds related to these illicit activities. And with that, I'll now introduce our panelists. Channing Mavrellis is Global Financial Integrity's Illicit Trade Director, focusing on the intersection of illicit financial flows, transnational crime, and international trade. Channing has over a decade of experience working on issues related to anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing. Not only is Channing the primary author of the report we will discuss today, but she also has researched and published several other studies for GFI, including transnational crime and the developing world. She has testified before Congress and has provided expert commentary to the OECD, United Nations, US Customs and Border Protection, as well as the US Department of State and US Department of Defense. John Cassara, who co-authored the China study with Channing, began his 26-year US government career as an intelligence officer during the Cold War. He later served as a Treasury special agent in both the US Secret Service and US Customs Service when he investigated money laundering, trade fraud, and international smuggling, and for 2 years was an undercover arms dealer. He has written 5 books, including Trade-Based Money Laundering, The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement, as well as Money Laundering and Illicit Financial Flows, Following the Money in Value Trails. John is also a member of the Global Financial Integrity Board of Directors. David Luna, who also joins us today, is President and CEO of Luna Global Networks and Convergence Strategies. A former US diplomat, David held numerous senior positions with the US Department of State, including directorships for national security, transnational crime and illicit networks, and anti-corruption and good governance. David also served as an assistant counsel to the president and was co-chair of the China-US Anti-Corruption Working Group. David is currently chair of the Anti-Illicit Trade Committee of the US Council for International Business and is also founder and executive director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies. Last but not least is Rob Zachariasiewicz, who spent 22 years with the Drug Enforcement Administration, where he helped to identify, investigate, and bring to justice some of the world's most powerful and elusive drug kingpins, narco-terrorists, and arms traffickers. Zach rose to be Deputy Chief of Office of Financial Investigations, and in that capacity, he was responsible for planning and overseeing global anti-money laundering programs and threat finance investigations, including the DEA's undercover money laundering operations and virtual currency initiative. Zach also spearheaded DEA's efforts to target money laundering networks affiliated with hostile states and organizations posing a threat to US national security. Each of our speakers will present for about 10 minutes, so that we'll have time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please post it in the Q&A section on your screen rather than raising your hand. And with that, let's get underway. Channing, we'll start with you.
Hi, good morning and afternoon, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to finally be able to release this report and talk about it. I'm going to give a really quick overview of the 4 crimes we covered in the report and talk a little bit about the big picture. So starting off with drug trafficking, China is a major source, transit, and destination country for narcotics trafficking. As of 2015, the domestic drug industry had an annual value of about $82 billion. So that's both consumption and production. Principal drugs produced are amphetamine type stimulants, new psychoactive substances, other synthetic drugs like fentanyl, as well as the production of precursor chemicals needed to manufacture these drugs, as well as others like heroin and cocaine. There is involvement of Chinese organized criminal groups, such as different Chinese triads, but I think more importantly also there's the involvement of these legitimate or registered companies and businesses within this trade. Speaking towards these legitimate companies and towards precursors, there are about 5,000 pharmaceutical and 160,000 chemical companies within China that can easily meet demand and also quickly respond to changes within chemical controls. To the big elephant in the room of fentanyl. Fentanyl and its precursors, when we're talking about Chinese-US trade, particularly with a lot of the fentanyl ending up in the US, I should say, they're increasingly being routed through Mexico and produced there if necessary, rather than going directly to the US like previously had been for several years. It's unclear if this response is related to an increased Chinese-US enforcement or if Mexican cartels are trying to have a larger slice of the market and profits like they have with methamphetamine and cocaine, a combination of those two or anything else. In terms of regulation, oversight, and enforcement, there are certainly a fair amount of weaknesses. For example, the guidelines to address non-pharmaceutical precursor chemicals, companies are encouraged to handle any violations in-house and only report severe cases to local authorities. This definitely presents issues with potential conflicts of interest, corruption with local authorities, as well as a lack of reporting from those local authorities to the National Narcotics Control Commission, which is a governmental body responsible for monitoring narcotics trafficking. Moving on to human trafficking, there are a unique combination of social and cultural drivers and policies, weak legislation, and obviously the active use of forced labor that are at play. Using data from the International Labor Organization and the Global Slavery Index, GFI puts a rough figure of about $19 billion as the annual value of human trafficking within China. Talking about the two kind of major types of human trafficking, the sexual exploitation most commonly involves forced prostitution, forced marriage, and online sexual exploitation within China. China's now rescinded one-child policy coupled with sex-selective abortions, with a strong preference for boys, has led to a really serious gender imbalance of what's known as surplus males, about 34 million more men than women within China. This has directly contributed to what is known as bride trafficking. Groups as well as individuals target vulnerable Chinese girls and women from poorer regions, as well as from kind of poorer neighboring countries. Some may involve consensual arranged marriages, whereby the bride and her family are deceived about the groom's circumstances, or may later be forced into sexual or labor exploitation. In regards to forced labor by state and non-state actors, it's most frequently used in the manufacturing, construction, fishing, and agricultural sectors. Technically, forced labor or this re-education through labor ended in 2013, but reports show it still continues. It's most obviously in use in the Xinjiang province with the repression and internment of Uyghurs and other Turkic-speaking Muslims. Human trafficking is targeted under China's criminal law, but there overall is a very strong preoccupation with sex trafficking, particularly prostitution, which in itself can be an voluntary or involuntary act. There's a large preoccupation with offenses against women and girls. So this overlooks other types of trafficking. It overlooks other types or forms of coercion, and it also overlooks the victimization of men and boys. In terms of counterfeiting and IP theft, Chinese counterfeiters manufacture basically anything and everything that can be sold. China and Hong Kong together are responsible for about 86% of globally traded counterfeits, which we have estimated to have a value of about 438 billion annually. And that's just for the global trade. We're not talking about the domestic trade in China or IP theft. In regards to IP theft, it's been estimated that they're responsible for 50 to 80% of international IP theft. The Chinese government relies on both soft and hard approaches to obtain IP. They encourage Chinese citizens who study and work abroad to engage in commercial espionage. They obtain it through joint ventures, research partnerships, sales and trading investments, as well as the state's forced technology transfer policy. A big kind of red flag or let's say issue in terms of intellectual property is the IP legislation in China is founded around this idea of first to file. That is, the law protects whomever is the first to file a patent with the government rather than whomever actually first came up with the invention. China has undertaken comprehensive reforms of its IP regime in the last few years. However, enforcement is still largely focused on the sale of counterfeits, particularly kind of e-commerce platforms, rather than the actual manufacturers of counterfeit goods. Given the scale of IP crime in China, it would be reasonable to conclude that counterfeiting represents a relatively important share of Chinese economy. A 2007 Euromonitor piece estimated that counterfeit products accounted for 15 to 20% of products made in China, which represents about 8% of China's GDP. Obviously, this estimate is about 15 years old. Counterfeiting, though, has at the very least remained stable, if not grown. So assuming that counterfeiting still represents 8% of China's GDP, this would equal about $1.2 trillion in 2020. Considering the significant economic implications, the willingness of Chinese officials to sufficiently crack down on counterfeiting, including putting a not so meager number of people out of work, comes into question. Finally, with wildlife, China has been recognized as the biggest player in both the global legal and illegal wildlife trades. The illegal wildlife trade in China is supplied in three main ways. Wildlife, their parts and their products are either kind of sourced abroad and trafficked into the country. They are legally farmed or produced domestically, and to a lesser extent, they are poached domestically. The commercial breeding of wildlife is not unique to China. What is singular to China is the size of the industry, the involvement of the government, the species that are farmed, and the function of the farming, which is notably farming for consumption, or previously farming for consumption, as well as farming for traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. The Chinese Academy of Engineering estimated that the farming of wildlife in China for the TCM industry is worth $7 billion annually. However, that figure does not take into account the illegal trade, which would likely make the figure many times higher. Over the last 30 years, China's protection of wildlife, as well as regulation of the wildlife trade, has become stricter as a whole. However, weaknesses still remain in China's response. For example, while the farming of wildlife for consumption has been banned, wildlife farming still exists, which continues to contribute to wildlife trafficking and presents a biosecurity risk. China has been effective at shutting down trade when it wants to. Examples include the ivory trade as well as wet markets, but those really come from the very top down. In terms of China's legislation, the intent of the wildlife protection law in itself says it's to protect wild animals, including saving species of wildlife which are rare or near extinction. However, the wildlife protection law also enshrines the right for individuals and entities to engage in captive wildlife breeding, setting the stage for a conflict of interest. I think it's definitely ignorant to believe that the captive breeding of certain species will take the pressure off their wild counterparts or protect the need to poach these species at all. Talking about big picture, China is definitely an interesting case study considering its active use and promotion of forced labor and IP theft, its dynamic, somewhat forceful pursuit of development, and its authoritarian nature. In terms of pursuit of development, the country is denied wanting to be a global hegemon. However, it's very clear it wants to be an economic and geopolitical powerhouse. As evidenced, it's crafted policies to aggressively support and protect important issues, industries, and sectors, things like manufacturing, TCM, pharmaceuticals, sometimes to the point of sacrificing potential avenues to address transnational crime and IFFs, illicit financial flows. For example, they prefer to target the platforms that allow the sale of counterfeits and precursor narcotics versus actually going after the manufacturers themselves. In terms of its authoritarianism, as an authoritarian state, the CCP has significant control over what happens in the country. It would be certainly an oversimplification to say that they know of and are responsible for everything that happens in the country. However, it's very reasonable, absolutely reasonable, I should say, to say that they have a monopoly over a fair share of what happens. Additionally, unlike democratic states, the CCP has the agency to quickly and severely respond to undesired activities, actors, and flows. The government's massive surveillance state apparatus allows them to collect, respond to, and respond to a considerable amount of information about citizens and businesses, identities, and activities, which in turn allows an extreme level of social control. So this brings to a question about how much of the illicit financial flows and the transnational crime that's happening is potentially from state policy, how much is it a direct, a connection to or cause of state policy, and how much of it is out of their control. I really look forward to turning it over to my colleague, John Cassara, right now, and him sharing more about illicit financial flow methodologies. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and it's such a pleasure to be here. First of all, I'd like to thank Channing for her great work in writing this paper and the very eloquent synopsis that you just gave. The idea for the project was mine, but I want to make clear that the paper is hers. I just kind of tinkered around the edges a little bit. GFI was very generous in including me as a co-author. I would also next like to thank Tom and all the wonderful people at Global Financial Integrity. Tom and GFI have exhibited a lot of courage and integrity going forward with this project. And next, I would like to thank all of you for listening in. I believe this topic has struck a chord. It's resonated with a lot of people and a lot of institutions, not only in the United States, but around the world. I hope this paper will begin the process of evaluating and calling attention to China's outsized role in transnational crime and international money laundering. In addition to GFI's important work, I'm also examining China's involvement in criminality for my own project. And I have three very brief and general takeaways. The first is, up to now, we've seen individual cases or examples, but what we're missing is the big picture, what I call the totality or the enormity of Chinese transnational crime and money laundering. It's just staggering if you put everything together. The average citizen might be somewhat aware that the African elephant or rhinoceros is in danger because of China's demand for ivory. Tropical forests are being destroyed to satisfy demand for wood products. Some might have knowledge that China's the largest manufacturing source of illicit tobacco products, or others might have experience being priced out of the local housing market due to suspicious Chinese capital flight. But these are individual issues and focused stories. What we've been ignoring or indifferent to is the massive, as I said, totality of what I call CCP Inc.'s transnational crime and Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies that facilitate and enable the criminality. Second, looking at internationally accepted data that covers specified unlawful activities, CCP Inc. and its actors are responsible for roughly half the money laundered every year globally. No other country comes close. Now, I know that's a very vague statement, and the numbers that I'm playing with are vague as well, but if you look at first of all, the estimate or the magnitude of international money laundering, granted it's imprecise, as are the estimates for some of the specified unlawful activities. But according to the IMF, in very round numbers, the total amount of money laundered worldwide is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 5% of world GDP, or very roughly, I use a figure of about $4 trillion a year. Of course, that depends on what's included in the count. For example, some include tax evasion or capital flight. Underground financial systems aren't generally included, this type of thing. Next, we need to examine the annual value of specified unlawful activities for money laundering. Channing just went over 4, and she gave some really good estimates as far as the dollar total annually. There are at least another 5 or 6 where Chinese criminality also likewise leads the world. And if you total them all up using internationally accepted estimates, the total is about $2 trillion, or roughly half that 4 trillion estimate of the magnitude of international money laundering. So to me, that's just staggering. My third major takeaway, and Channing kind of touched on this, is that the CCP is depending directly or indirectly behind much of this. I think there's no doubt for things like IPR theft, identity theft, proliferation, the CCP is behind this. There are other things such as human trafficking, narcotics trafficking. There's some tenuous links there. It's important to remember that China is an authoritarian command state. If it wanted to crack down on the fentanyl trade, it could. For example, just looking at the advertising that goes behind the fentanyl trade for its analogs and its precursors, with a few flips of switches, they could take down the advertising that occurs online and on social media, but for whatever reason, they choose not to do that. It's also important to examine China-centric money laundering methodologies, or as I call them, money laundering methodologies with Chinese characteristics. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, recognized 3 major money laundering methodologies through financial institutions, bulk cash smuggling, and trade. China certainly is involved with all those 3. And in law enforcement, we say money laundering is only limited by the criminal's imagination. So there are other or additional methodologies that are uniquely Chinese, or where China is becoming the dominant player. For example, Chinese actors are becoming the money launderers of choice in the black market peso exchange. I'm not going to spend any time elaborating on this. I know Zach has had a lot of direct experience with this. He may direct some of his remarks to this. But I do want to add that Chinese involvement in black market exchanges is not confined just to the Western Hemisphere. Chinese criminals use many of these same trade-based money laundering techniques around the world. Another Chinese-centric money laundering methodology is Bai Chen, or flying money. I'm not going to explain flying money now, except to say that it's very similar to the better-known Hawala system. And similar to Hawala, historically and culturally, flying money uses trade in the process of countervaluation over and under invoicing as a means of balancing the books between brokers. Although normally used for underground money remittances, because it is so opaque and secretive, flying money is often used or abused by criminals and criminal networks. Almost also impervious to detection by traditional countermeasures such as financial intelligence reporting requirements. But of course, black market exchanges and flying money are just subsets of trade-based money laundering. Actually, trade fraud or customs fraud is the largest component of TBML. And similarly, abusive trade misinvoicing is the biggest element of illicit financial flows, or IFFs. China is the world's largest trading nation. And although this has never been systematically examined, if just a small percentage of Chinese trade is involved with trade-based value transfer, underground finance, even capital flight, then you could easily add multi-hundreds of billions of dollars a year to the SUA, specified unlawful activities total we talked about earlier. Another China-centric money laundering methodology is Chinese underground banking, sometimes known as CUBS. This is a loose-knit network of money dealers, traders, cryptocurrency brokers, who move currencies in and out of the economy while sidestepping the country's regulated banking system, currency controls, and capital flight restrictions. Chinese authorities admit that significant illicit proceeds flow out of the country through the underground banking operations, and we know conversely that proceeds of crime are also moved into China. Chinese money launderers also frequently use gaming or casino gambling. For example, this has been documented in British Columbia via the Cullen Commission of Inquiry. I encourage those interested to review the Cullen Commission's stellar investigative findings about the China-centric Vancouver method of money laundering. The model uses casino gambling as a way for foreign and domestic criminals to launder legitimate funds. Illicit proceeds are further laundered through the purchase of real estate. And the same type of Chinese money laundering methodology is found in Australia and other nations. There are many other heavily Chinese influenced money laundering methodologies and what I call facilitators and enablers. Some of these include the popular use of offshores and secrecy jurisdictions, corruption, the great facilitator, the use of espionage and organized crime, CCP-sponsored programs that target and lure those with information useful to China, the proliferation of China-controlled free trade zones, lack of Chinese international money laundering enforcement, lack of international law enforcement cooperation in general, and a sorry record of AML compliance. Now, some of these issues were briefly addressed in the papers and others not. As I mentioned, I'm doing my own independent research and writing on some of these topics, but I encourage others to do the same. In the world of AML enforcement, China's involvement has been overlooked for too long. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Zach. Rob. Or I'm sorry, is it David? Who's up next, Tom?
Yeah, thank you, John.
David, thanks.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Let me put my video here. As the Executive Director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, I am honored to be invited to speak in support of the new GFI report made in China and the growing illegal trade and corruptive influence by China Inc., China's network of state-owned enterprises and criminal triads across licit and illicit markets globally. And I would like to first thank GFI, Channing and John for their outstanding scholarship, leadership, and energies in authoring this important report. In my testimony last year to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee on the impacts of China's illicit economies to U.S. national security, I underscored my concern about China's complicity in fueling greater corruption and criminality in many parts of the world, hurting not only U.S. competitiveness, but also endangering the public health and safety of Americans and those living in many communities globally. These sentiments were similarly expressed with strong bipartisan support, including by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bill Cassidy, who forcefully underscored that China is growing more brazen in their mission to undermine the United States and international institutions. Corruption and illicit trade are among the enabling drivers of China's national aspirations to global economic power and to advance its aggressive foreign policy and great power competition strategies. China's illicit trade facilitates a convergence of crimes that spawns bigger destabilizing threats across the international community. In fact, earlier this year, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, in its annual report, unequivocally stated, "We are clear-eyed about China's doubling down on its harmful trade and economic abuses." The state-sponsored corruption exported through its strident foreign policies sanctioned at the top levels of the Chinese government, through state-owned enterprises, or through its external economic development initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. GFI's new evidence-based report is very significant, and I would say timely, in further providing important insights into the ways and means that China is sustaining its own economy. The CCP holds to power and financing its foreign economic policy to construct a new world order that is more dangerous and chaotic, less democratic, and flaunts universal values of human rights, the rule of law, peace, and sustainable security in China and abroad. As we just heard, China's role in diverse forms of illicit trade and dark commerce includes the trafficking of illegal fentanyl, humans, counterfeits, endangered wildlife, as well as money laundering, trade-based money laundering, and other illicit activities across black markets and across the digital world. As Channing and John also just noted, China's involvement in the expansion of these illicit economies and China's corruptive influence is manifesting itself 24/7, 365 days a year, expanding the multi-trillion-dollar global illegal economy and China's power and wealth. The effects of CCP Inc.'s illicit trade and illicit economies are multifaceted and are further multiplied by its malign influence in the United States, for example, as the U.S. Department of Justice recently noted. As further highlighted as well in the report, illicit activities such as the illicit fentanyl trade not only harms our people, killing tens of thousands of young Americans each year, it becomes a threat multiplier. It enables Mexican cartels to earn tens of billions of dollars a year in dirty money, some of which is laundered in China, and the financing enables the cartels to infiltrate the Mexican government and CCP Inc. to penetrate legitimate sectors and supply chains. Such crime convergence fuels greater violence, corruption, insecurity, and instability in Mexico, Central America, and other violent hotspots and armed conflicts in many parts of the world. Another harm to American and global security is driven from China's illegal trade and unregulated economy and the flooding of counterfeits, oftentimes dangerous and toxic fake products, into the US market and online marketplaces, including foodstuff, footwear and apparel, toys, electronics, personal protective equipment, and pharmaceuticals. According to some estimates, including the OECD, China accounts for up to 80% of all counterfeits in the global marketplace. The proliferation of these counterfeits, especially electronics, also endangers our national security and the safety of our troops when fake parts or computer microchips find themselves in our military systems, weaponry, and supply chain. Chinese state-sponsored hackers and criminals continue to steal the intellectual property of the United States government and American companies, hurting our innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth. As the GFI report highlights, China is responsible for 50 to 80% of international IP theft. Let me also commend GFI and its authors for highlighting the harms caused by human trafficking and the trafficking of endangered wildlife and other environmentally sensitive goods. China has exploited forced labor to manufacture and export counterfeits as a competitive advantage to expand its economy and increase greater global market share for Chinese products. For years, Chinese demand for illegal wildlife products have driven a global trade in endangered species, including many of the iconic animals such as rhinoceros, tigers, elephants, bears, and so many other animals. Oftentimes, these illicit products have included the role of unsavory actors such as the cartels, terrorist organizations, or rogue regimes such as North Korea. The U.S. Department of State has also continually flagged China's abuse of human rights, forced labor, human trafficking activities, including as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. A few final points in support of the new GFI report. John is correct in characterizing China's cross-border illicit finance activities as the biggest money laundering hub in the world. In our own Gaia report in July of this year, the dark side of illicit economies and trade-based money laundering, we stress how ports across Americas continue to be exploited or remain vulnerable to transnational criminal organizations that corrupt officials and strategically use maritime shipping as illogical platforms to move tens of billions of dollars worth of illicit goods and contraband. It is a reality today that China controls all or portions of 37 major ports in Latin America. At these rates of illicit trade and China's complicity, one could argue that CCP Inc. is the biggest transnational illicit trade syndicate driving today's global economy and related corruption. Making matters worse, China has shown little inclination to cooperate with the international law enforcement community in combating many of these criminal activities and corresponding money laundering. China simply turns a blind eye and points the finger at other countries for inaction and shifts the burden of lack of enforcement to others. Why? Because it is so darn profitable. While China continues to distract attention away from its role in transnational crime through disinformation, malign influence, and other state-sponsored subversive acts, the reality remains that it is sustaining its economy, prosperity, and global competitiveness through being a global key driver of cross-border crime and corruption. The US and international community must confront, and constructively engage China to be a more responsible global leader and market citizen of the world in addressing the array of illicit threats that harm US security and the collective security of all nations. The clear and convincing evidence and market data presented by the new GFI report emphatically demonstrates that CCP Inc. is sabotaging legitimate commerce and siphoning away the economic prosperity of nations who play by the global trade system of rules and by the rule of law. Thank you. And let me now turn it over to Bob.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Zachariasiewicz. With a name like that, I obviously go by a nickname. So from here forward, I'm Zach. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And I thank the group for having me. Channing, John, very appreciated. It's an impressive list of speakers. And I guess I'll just start by saying it's a little humbling to be even asked to speak with the talent that's not only speaking, but if you look at the invite list that's here. So thank you. I'm going to keep my talk somewhat baseline and not particularly technical. So I may not come off nearly as polished and intellectual as some of my esteemed colleagues have that have spoken before me, but and with fantastic presentations. But I do actually find Chinese money laundering, and specifically in the drug trade, to be somewhat fascinating in its simplicity. So I don't think that there's a need to get particularly technical. I'm also not going to talk in tremendous detail about too many cases. There's a few I'll mention, but I'm certainly willing to turn folks on to the real experts if that's ever needed. There's some unbelievable cases that have been run in DEA by some really phenomenal agents. And if that's pertinent for anyone, we can certainly discuss that either in the Q&A or I can make myself available after. And one final point I'll make is that up front is that I'm only going to be speaking to the drug trade in terms of Chinese money laundering. But as John pointed out, these same systems and techniques are utilized throughout the world to evade authorities, to duck tax payments, et cetera. In fact, a colleague of mine who was based in Western Europe a few years ago told me that in his estimation, and I think in many folks' estimation, that the drug money laundering is simply a drop in the bucket in comparison to the tax evasion that the Chinese money laundering networks cheat the world out of in this instance, specifically the EU that he was referring to. It's hard to even get your arms around the dollar value spoken. But again, I'm going to keep my presentation narrow and somewhat up from on-the-ground experience, as this is a topic that I believe is rife with rabbit holes that one can easily fall down into. So DEA established a large umbrella under which to run Chinese money laundering investigations. And that kind of happened by accident. The project, what came to be known as Project Sleeping Giant. And I'll start by explaining what a project is. So in DEA, we have cases, and then our Special Operations Division spearheads the coordination of cases throughout the world. And when enough cases are connected, they become projects. And or they become operations. And then when enough operations overlap, they make a blanket project to kind of cover all of those. So what began to happen is we have money laundering operations that we call AGEOs, Attorney General Exempted Operations. And those are very technical money laundering operations in which the Attorney General has given authority under the law for us to engage in money laundering, to essentially break the law. So for example, when you're dealing in narcotics, we can't put any narcotics on the street at all, meaning if we had an undercover operation, we can't pose as drug dealers and allow drugs to go through, especially in this day of fentanyl, where one speck can kill someone. So money laundered operations are specific opportunities for us to really play a role, or to play a part, to act in an undercover manner, where we actually engage in many instances as either folks needing to have our money laundered, or as money launderers themselves. We can actually launder portions of narcotics profits to infiltrate money laundering organizations. And Colombian undercovers have traditionally been our bread and butter. We had the whole thing's a broker system. I'll start by saying a cartel is the worst used word ever. Cartel is just a system of investors, and it gets sexy. We like to talk about it, but really the entire drug trade is not as organized as, in my opinion, as it's made out to be. It's a system of brokers. It's just people knowing other people that can fulfill a need for them. And the money laundering side of that is no different. So what'll happen is you'll have an organization, say a Mexican drug organization, and they will have $1 million sitting in the United States that they need to repatriate to Mexico. And so what happens is they go to money brokers, who then will take on the contract and say, I can move this money for you for X%. Typically, you might see anywhere from 10 to 15% was pretty standard. You might see a little less than that for, a really good money launderer, especially when the margins are high. But typically, there was a nice profit to be made by the money launderer. And then all of a sudden, what happens is Chinese money launderers, Chinese brokers down in Mexico come in and start undercutting the whole market. And this is somewhere around 2016 to 18 again. We didn't know initially that this was going on. The way we found this out is our Colombian undercover informants, who constantly get contracts, start losing out on contracts. And when I say lose out, again, it's a broker system. They don't go to one person and say, this job is yours if you want it. They might go to 3 or 4 people at a time and say, hey, we've got X number of dollars to move, and here's our time frame. And the first one that comes up with a good offer is probably going to get the job. And next thing you know, all of our undercovers are just losing out on contracts left and right. And we didn't know why. Well, when you go back and do your homework, what we came to find out is that the Chinese were offering contracts at 0 to 6%, 0%. I'm going to explain later why they would do that, why it was profitable to them. But the bottom line is they wanted the US dollars that badly sitting in the United States that it was worth them to launder the money to Mexico. So the way the DEA started finding out this was happening was really somewhat through word of mouth. You had agents just simply speaking together. So let's say you had an investigative meeting to coordinate some cases throughout the country. And you have an agent from LA, and he's talking to an agent in New York. And the agent in New York says, I had the weirdest thing happen the other day. I was doing a Mexican money laundering case, and a Asian guy, a Chinese guy, showed up in the middle of it. It was just really odd. I don't know how he fit into these Mexicans. And the guy from LA says, well, that's odd, because I had the exact same thing happen to me from, 2 years ago. And then maybe there's another money launderer from another agent from St. Louis, and he overhears them and he says, well, the same thing happened to me. We are criminal investigators. This is what we will call a trend that we identified. So we start to see that the Chinese have somehow gotten involved in this. And so we started running some operations to investigate why. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ProPublica article, excellent article that just came out. And it detailed one really, really good money laundering operation that we had. It didn't start as a money laundering operation. It actually wasn't under an AGEO that I described. It was a drug case out of Memphis that ultimately evolved into identifying and going after some Colombian cocaine sources of supply. But as the investigation unfolded and some different investigative techniques were utilized, Gigi Lee and his partner Chinaloa, female, literally based in Sinaloa, Mexico, that used the handle Chinaloa, which I think says it all, came to be identified and targeted. And it's through cases like that and a phenomenal money laundering operation run out of our office in New Jersey called Operation Spin Cycle, which is the best money laundering operation I've ever seen. It started targeting these Chinese networks. So later in my career, I got tasked with after spending 15 years in the international arena, with running a gang group in Washington, D.C. I made that a group focused on fentanyl, and we started being pretty effective at penetrating networks, bringing narcotic shipments into the city. So I got a call, and I was asked to provide an undercover and do a pickup. Somebody had an informant that was asked to pick up $500,000 in Baltimore. And so we already had a blanket money laundering operation to put this under, and my group took the case. What was interesting was the agent or the supervisor that called me said, listen, there's one rub. You have to use a Chinese undercover. He said, just any old, Asian undercover isn't good enough. You have to have a Chinese undercover. Fortunately, I had a task force officer assigned to my group, Ricky Wu, was phenomenal undercover and was Chinese. And so we were able to fulfill that. I didn't really get why in the beginning, and he explained that they were expecting it to be Chinese. And that was my first involvement. My group went on to call the operation, or our operation was Operation General Sal's Burrito. So he had a little bit of a snarky group, and they found that name to be a nice mix of the idea that it was Mexican drug money and Chinese money launderers moving it. So what happened in that case is we did actually pick up the money. It was laundered in undercover fashion to advance the case and start to identify the money laundering network and who was involved. Two really interesting things to show how related it is to the drug trade. The Mexican drug traffickers that dropped off this money, we identified them. They were part of some really, really big hitters down in Mexico, but we also tied them to a network of tractor trailer drivers throughout the country that were both delivering drugs throughout the country, and most specifically fentanyl. They'd already been had a major arrest in New York for 13 kilograms of fentanyl, I believe. And they were also taking bulk cash back to Mexico. So what you're seeing is the same people that they were using to move bulk cash, they have this better system where these Chinese are willing to assist the Mexicans and take it down to Mexico for them, or transport actually through a mirror exchange that I'll explain to Mexico. Ultimately, I moved out of that group at the end of my career. I was promoted, and I was a deputy chief of financial investigations. I took the operational side, and I helped coordinate DEA's money laundering investigations throughout the world. And as part of that responsibility, I oversaw all of those AGEOs. So I really got some insight into the cases that DEA had going on targeting this. I partnered up with a phenomenal agent named Chris Urban, very close friend of mine, who was running Project Sleeping Giant. And I really made Chinese money laundering our focus. One of my still fears with all of this, I think China's gotten a lot more attention, for better or for worse, to a lot of folks who don't maybe look at this stuff due to COVID and its origins in China. But I still fear that we don't take this threat for what it actually is. There's absolutely a state-sponsored element to it, and I think anytime you have state-sponsored involvement, it just takes a transnational criminal organization to another level. So the mechanism, what exactly did we see? So again, I'm just going to explain this through example. I'm sorry if it's not particularly eloquent, but I think it'll give a better understanding. So what started to happen, or what we uncovered, is you had Chinese money brokers sitting in Mexico. Why? Well, there's a massive Chinese diaspora throughout the world. And if you take a look at any of the money laundering groups, the original, Jewish money laundering groups, Pakistani money laundering groups were massive up until a few years ago. Hezbollah, incredibly active in money laundering throughout the world. Well, all of these are groups that have had a large diaspora, that have family connections throughout the world. And that's what's the grease that makes some of this engine work. It's the ability to speak to anybody, anywhere, have a guy, have a relative that you can trust, or some type of connection that you can trust to actually engage in this. And that's what makes mirror exchanges, what John referred to as a wallet. It's basically just, it's a vouch system where you don't have to use formal banking systems for a lot of these processes to occur. So in China, you had Chinese money brokers that ended up aligning with Mexican cartels. And as I explained earlier, gave them a great deal, a much lower VIG. But not only were they offering such a low percentage to launder the money, they were offering to do it almost in real time. So there's two advantages of this. One, takes out a lot of risk. People want their money quickly. But two, that's how, for lack of a more eloquent word, that's how bad guys know whether or not law enforcement is involved. They know that law enforcement, even in our sophisticated money laundering operations, generally cannot move money immediately. We can't do mirror exchanges. It's incredibly hard. We've had some really sophisticated money laundering ops where we've gotten closer, but if the exchange is going to happen really quickly, it gives them a good sense that law enforcement has not infiltrated them. And so the way it would work is the Chinese money broker, the Mexican trafficker would come to a Chinese money broker in Mexico, in Sinaloa, and say, hey, I've got $500,000 sitting in Baltimore. I'll use my group's example. And the Chinese money broker says, okay, let me get back to you in a couple minutes. Make sure. He said, yep, I have somebody who can take care of that. We'll have your money to you ASAP. And again, I'll explain the low percentage in a second, but they come to an agreement here. And so what happens is they take a dollar bill, and the Mexican usually provides the dollar bill to the Chinese and says, okay, here's the code. Give me a phone number. And the Chinese broker will provide a phone number for his contact that's going to pick the money up in Baltimore. The Mexican will go back to his drug contacts and say, okay, here's the serial number that you have to read off, call this number and make arrangements. So then the Chinese courier in the Baltimore area will just receive a phone call, and the guy will read off a serial number from the dollar bill. The Chinese contact already has that from his boss down in Mexico. Everybody's good. They meet and they hand off the $500,000. As soon as that money is handed off, the Chinese courier will alert back to Mexico to his Chinese supervisor that the money's good. He can turn the money over. And the Chinese supervisor immediately turns the money over to the cartel. Cartel's out of it now. The drug organization is out of it. They've got their money. They're done. And now it's all sitting in the Chinese courier's hands. Now, when I say Chinese courier, there's actually a supervisor that's going to cover that region in the East Coast. And it might, in my experience, the Baltimore region actually stretched from Baltimore all the way up to New York. But we literally have examples of cases where you had that same situation and the money had to be picked up, let's say in Kansas or in Missouri, and a broker was sent. It's run by East Coast or West Coast. It's pretty much LA or New York. That's where the Chinese had the big Chinatown areas where it usually was centralized, and that's where the command and control was. So they would send couriers from all over the country, sometimes driving money across the country. Once that the courier picks up the money, it's given to the broker or the regional supervisor, let's call him, and he runs a collection point. They have a, in our parlance, that's just the stash house. And so a couple of these collections happen, and then a few $1 million piles up in the stash house. Now at that point, they've got to get rid of this cash and they want to get it into their Chinese system. So what do they use? Well, 9 times out of 10, they're using WeChat. For those not familiar with WeChat, it's a communication application on your phone. It's very similar. We refer to it, DEA, we used to refer to it as the Chinese WhatsApp. It's owned by a $1 billion company that's a listed publicly traded company called Tencent. And it's all done openly on message boards, but generally in Mandarin. And so nobody can really understand what's being written. So they're just hiding in plain sight, which is a little bit of the brilliance of it. And basically you'll have the person holding the money will simply get on WeChat and he'll send a message out. Who's looking for currency? I have $200,000. Some Chinese immigrant who needs US currency will simply say, I'm looking for that. Happy to do it. They'll meet on the corner of Walk and Don't Walk. Bag of money gets handed out. They both get out their smartphones and they do a Chinese bank to Chinese bank exchange. The US financial system's never used. Why do Chinese immigrants here need the money? Because there's capital flight laws in China that say you can only take out $50,000 of your money a year. And so people here, whether it's to pay their child's college tuition, in many instances, they've been buying up real estate left and right, open businesses, but for whatever reason, they need the money. And so that's simply why they do it. We even got to the point where we started to see Colombian organizations moving their money into Mexico just simply to become part of the system. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly just say, aside from those money exchanges, just to people looking for currency, you'll also see these same money collectors take large portions of that. They'll buy goods, trade-based money laundering. So for example, they might go into a cell phone store, buy $200,000 worth of cell phones. They'll ship them to Dubai and sell them for a profit. Once these monies all get back to China, they're turned over to import-export companies that again then send goods back to Mexico. And the point of all that is it's a never-ending, self-fulfilling system. And the brilliance of it is that money's being made every step of the way. The drug profits are turning into money laundering profits, et cetera, on down the line. I know I probably left a lot of questions unanswered. I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A, but I want to turn it back over and not take too much time.
Well, thank you, Zach, and thanks to David and John and Channing for this just terrific overview of this fascinating topic and global criminal enterprise problem. We're close to 11 o'clock, but we've got some very good questions. We'll probably go over just a little bit, maybe not too long, but what I'd like to do is maybe go in reverse order and start with Zach. Zach, you explained how there's lots of excellent communication between DEA agents around the US, putting together different pieces of the puzzle, as well as working with informants in various countries. How good is the sort of law enforcement to law enforcement communication between DEA and your peers in other places? What brings the question to mind is this recent announcement that FATF and Interpol have agreed to share information to identify and seize criminal assets. How good is the law enforcement communication between U.S. law enforcement and maybe some of the law enforcement in some of our partner countries?
Yeah, so I'll just speak from DEA experience. The one thing that I found out about the Chinese money laundering is we didn't generally run into too many other US-based law enforcement agencies, as we often do in different types of investigations, although HSI had some really vibrant programs as well. Internationally, DEA's bread and butter are our international counterparts. We have more agents stationed throughout the world than any federal law enforcement agency. And we thrive off that. So I'd say ours is phenomenal. We could never have undertaken these operations without the help of folks literally all over the world. We do undercover money pickups all over the world in coordination with local authorities. And so it's just, that was the most enjoyable part of the job for me. I spent 15 years in the international community, and it's just utterly essential to our success.
Very good. Thanks, Zach. To David. David, you've got deep understanding of global trade and illicit trade. China has 4 of the world's 5 largest container ports. You mentioned the ports it controls in Latin America. I think it's got a control of 100 ports around the world. So it's got means of production, it's got means of distribution, if you want to think of it in that sort of that terminology. What can be done in the context of global trade? Does World Customs Organization or World Trade Organization or any of these other multilaterals have a role to play in trying to reduce some of this illicit activity?
Yeah, Tom, thanks for the question. And, I think before we get to the World Customs Organization or the WTO or even the OECD, and, it is important that within the international community and that collectively we began to put more pressure on China to crack down on illicit trade and the corruptive influence. Because as you know, it's not only the 37 ports in Latin America, it's more than 100 globally. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, has really enabled China to expand these illicit markets. And, as John alludes to in this CPP Inc., it is, a confluence of state-owned enterprises and, Chinese triads and Chinese entrepreneurs as well, as Dr. Shally at TRAC has alluded to with BPEs. What is important and the great thing about the GFI report is we're beginning to really see evidence-based research and the data to show the breadth and scale of this, China's complicity across illicit markets. And I think that began to process to leverage the WCO, to leverage the OECD, to leverage the WTO, to really hold China more accountable. and put pressure bilaterally with the Chinese government on these illicit areas.
Great, thanks, David. John, to you, David mentioned your reference to CCP Inc. or China Inc. Let's tease that sort of private sector terminology out a little bit. If you think of how they're operating, these are various revenue streams that this CCP Inc. is trying to expand as much as they possibly can, whether it's wildlife trafficking or fentanyl or what have you. How do you begin to turn off the spigot? How do you squeeze these different lines of business, if you want to put it that way, either from law enforcement perspective, multilateral perspective? What are the tools that we have in our tool belt to be able to try to reduce some of this?
Thank you for that question. And that's kind of the gist of why we're here. What can we do about all of this? I think part of the answer is to finally look at this issue and take action from an international, a domestic and international coordinated law enforcement response. We've looked at China, we've looked at it from the military perspective, economic, commercial perspective, diplomatic perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a lot of data, a lot of information. We have structures set up, but what we've not yet done is to look at China from a coordinated and a law enforcement perspective. I mean, Zach talked about individual cases. I mean, and we've done some great things, but we need to focus, and we need to, perhaps here in this country, we need to establish China focused task force. We need to work with our international counterparts. There's no substitute for that. We need to educate ourselves on the Chinese threat. We need to learn about Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies. We need to have the political will to do all these things, which sometimes it's hard. There's a lot of corrupt actors out there, but I would like to see us focus on law enforcement, and I think that might really make a major impact on China CCP Inc. They haven't responded to much else, but if we use our unparalleled enforcement abilities, I think they will take notice.
Can I just piggyback one thing on that? And I think I can answer one of the questions that got posed when I was speaking at the same time. Fantastic points. I agree with all of that. So on the last question that I addressed, international cooperation, tying together with those remarks, and also a question that was asked before, is it on the screen, is it state-sponsored or merely state-tolerated approved? So I'll start by saying, again, I completely concur with those remarks. I was asked about cooperation. Our cooperation overseas is unbelievable. We have a big project, a problem. We go to the Colombians and say, how can we tackle this together? Complete opposite with China. We're told we can't go, we can't share. Everything will be exposed, everything will be compromised. So we have to operate in a vacuum and find ways to operate without that top cover. That's just reality. And then secondly, as far as being state-sponsored or merely state-tolerated, I'll answer that through questions. I just explained that there's capital flight laws of $50,000 a year. We've seen what the Chinese do to stop COVID outbreaks, how draconian they can be. I would ask everyone listening, if the Chinese have this capital flight law, and literally if all the capital left the country, their economy would collapse. It's a house of cards to begin with. So clearly they could stop this if they wanted it. And why don't they? Because they're profiting from it. I think at certain levels they're involved with it. The triads are certainly involved on some levels, Chinese organized crime, who cooperate directly with high levels of the government. So that would be my answer.
Great, thanks, Zach, and thanks, John. we're a bit over 11 o'clock, so we'll have one last question for Channing before we wrap up. There was a question asked from the audience about Afghanistan and Pakistan being global hub for the opium trade and China's role in that, as well as not only in the trade, but in the laundering of the money in Europe. Channing, what can you tell us about that?
Sure. So definitely, as you point out, it's interesting. I think we kind of forget that China does border the Golden Crescent, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. However, they get the overwhelming majority of their narcotics from the Golden Triangle, Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, particularly Myanmar, because it's so close to Yunnan province, it's close to infrastructure, it's close to large population centers, whereas you're talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, they're way out to the west near Xinjiang. And so the majority of the trade, particularly heroin, that you're seeing going into China for consumption is going to be coming in from Yunnan province, from the Golden Triangle. In terms of the financial flows, there's definitely, we discussed in a couple of cases, actual Chinese banks in Europe that have been prosecuted by European governments for allowing illicit financial flows, for allowing tax evasion, money laundering, things like that. Definitely with some, state involvement. I think in terms of when you think about these informal value transfer systems like Feishian, like Hawala, they're really community and ethnic based. So, in terms of connecting with each other, it would, I think, largely stay within the Chinese community. It could be, there could be connections potentially in terms of Chinese communities within Europe to China, but I don't know if it would naturally connect between, let's say, a Afghani or a Pakistani like Hawaladar and somebody from the Chinese underground banking system or the Feishian markets. So I think they do remain a little bit isolated, but in terms of it going to Europe and Central Europe, if somebody in China does want access to that hard currency and to that funds, probably somebody is there to help make it available.
Great, thanks, Channing. Thanks to Channing and our other participants, David, John, and Zach. Thanks to our attendees for today. We appreciate your interest in the topic and spending even a little bit more than an hour with us to talk about it. We could probably be here with Q&A for another hour, but we're not able to do that. If anyone in the audience does have a follow-up question that we weren't able to get to, Channing has put her email in the chat. It's cmavrellis@gfintegrity.org. So if you have a question for her or David or John or Zach, you can send it to Channing and she'll divert it to the appropriate person. Thanks again for your interest. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.